So again, tonight we're going to talk about anxiety and mood disorders, the very first lesson in clinical psychology. So again, since this is the first lesson in the unit, I want to go over just a brief introduction to disorders, talk a little bit about the DSM-5. Then we're going to talk about anxiety and mood disorders, and then we're going to go back to different psychological perspectives of these disorders. And it's really good that we're doing that because that helps you to review all those schools of thought that you've been looking at throughout your time in AP Psychology. It started with the very first unit, but it seems like, every unit you're going to talk about the big schools of thought, and this is no different. Okay? So on each slide, I try to put the learning targets. That way you know that we're covering exactly what's going to be on the AP exam. So the first learning target for this unit is that you know about the DSM. So we're currently on the DSM-5. I believe that we're going to go to the DSM-6 very soon. I found that quote on Twitter. You're in her DMs. I'm in her DSM-5. We are not the same. Yeah. So what the DSM-5 is just the fifth version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, publishes this, and what it does is it just lists all the various disorders, and now there are quite a few. There are about 400, and the diagnostic criteria that you must meet in order to have that disorder. So again, or let's back up and just talk about what a disorder is. So a disorder is when you have deviant behavior, okay? But it doesn't just have to be deviant, because when I say deviant, I mean that it's different than average. Well, Olympic athletes certainly are deviant. They're much better than average. Their behavior is. So it's not just deviant. It also has to have like some harm, be not beneficial to you and your ability to function. Okay, so a psychological disorder must be deviant, distressful, or dysfunctional behavior and patterns for it to be a disorder. Okay. So the DSM-5, it's been criticized because, some things end up in it that people either agree or disagree with. So learning target 8B asks you to understand what historical conceptions of psychological disorders were. So up until 1973, homosexuality was a disorder. And up until very recently, having a different gender identity than your born sex was also a disorder. Both of those have come out of the DSM. So that's something that gets flack because what we see as a disorder does change. Okay, and some things that are disorders, categorized as disorders in the DSM, you might not think are actual disorders. Okay. So 8C says discuss the intersection between psychology and the legal system. Well, the legal system is all about punishing individuals who have wronged society, or I guess giving them a consequence so that way they can change their behavior, right? Well, if someone has a legitimate medical problem, a disorder, it's difficult to hold them accountable, at least in the same way that you would hold someone accountable who does not have that disorder. So one of the things that we need to talk about is the insanity defense. What you need to know is that it's a very high bar that is set for the insanity defense, meaning you have to be I don't want to say crazy, but you have to be pretty disassociated from reality for that to fly. My husband's actually an attorney. He's a prosecutor, and he sees it very infrequently that, one, people claim the insanity defense because most attorneys will tell them that they should not because it's so difficult for that to actually work. And two, if you claim the insanity defense, both the prosecution and the defense are going to put on proof as to whether or not you're insane and get their own psychiatric experts to test you. And rarely do both sides agree. However, like, he's got one gentleman that he is prosecuting right now who is very disassociated with reality, and both experts have said that he is not competent to stand trial. So we have to think about what will we do then? Okay, so this person is brought up on charges of child pornography, and there's lots of evidence for it. So do we release that person back in society? The thinking is no. So generally, people who claim the insanity defense, and it actually works, they go to a mental institution, and generally they could stay there until they are medicated or given therapy to be able to be competent to stand trial, and then they could actually have the trial, or they could just stay in that mental institution as long as the prison sentence would have ran, and then it's kind of a non-issue. Another thing that we need to talk about is confidentiality. So if you go to a therapist, the things that you say in therapy are confidential, and they cannot be used against you like in a court of law. However, if you are saying things in therapy where you are admitting to causing harm to other individuals, or are likely to cause harm to other individuals in the future, then that therapist has a duty to report that to the police, so that way other people will not be harmed. But almost everything else is going to stay confidential. Okay. Since we have this DSM, we're able to categorize people and to label them with certain disorders if they meet the criteria. This has good and bad effects. It's good because it allows us to give them proper treatment. If we know what the problem is and we've labeled it, then we know how to proceed. The problem is that there's a lot of negative consequences that come with those labels as well. So there's Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That's a famous movie about an insane asylum. Well, the Rosenhan study that's mentioned here in the course description, it's kind of a crazy study in that the psychologists or the research participants, they went into a psychiatric hospital and said that they were having delusions, okay, just on the intake. After the intake, they made no more claims, acted completely sane, because these were sane individuals. They were just pretending to have delusions when they came in. And they held them for quite some time, like months, before they were actually permitted to leave, even though they didn't have any symptoms except for on the intake. So what this shows us is that label does matter. And so the psychiatrist who continued to treat them basically explained all of their behavior, even though it wasn't deviant while they were in there. They could explain that behavior based on things that they saw in their past, even though there wasn't anything to really show. Okay? It was just a ruse, just to see what the effect is of those labels. That's commitment. When you stay in a research study for months just to prove that labels have an effect, a negative effect. Okay, so we've done the intro to clinical psychology learning targets, just the DSM, what has been considered a disorder in the past, what effects that has on the legal system, and what positive and negative effects that has. I want to go back to the strengths and weaknesses of each of the approaches after we do some of the disorders, after we talk about some of them. Okay, so there are several anxiety disorders. Okay, this learning target includes all the anxiety disorders plus the mood disorders. So we'll talk about the anxiety disorders here and the mood disorders on the next slide. So general anxiety disorder, the symptoms of that is just having really low levels of chronic anxiety. What's bad about this disorder is that you can't really pinpoint a reason, but a lot of people who have generalized anxiety disorder, even though they can't pinpoint the exact reason why they're having, chronic anxiety, they generally have a history of childhood trauma or neglect. And 2/3 of the people diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder are women. Panic disorders, you've heard probably of, I had a panic attack. That's when your heart races, you feel like you are about to have a heart attack. You have shortness of breath, chest pains. What's funny is Jack Nicholson was in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He's got another movie here, As Good as It Gets, where he has obsessive-compulsive disorder. And then another movie, which just escapes me. I was going to put it in the PowerPoint, a picture of it, where he has panic disorder and phobias. Okay, so he plays all kinds of characters with differing disorders. But in that, he has a heart attack. It's the one where he's with Diane Keaton and he's dating Diane Keaton's daughter and Diane Keaton. Anyway, he kind of has a panic attack and goes to the hospital, and they're like, you're not having a heart attack. You are having a panic attack instead. So it has very similar conditions as a heart attack, and a lot of people actually go to the hospital, to the emergency room, thinking they're having a panic or a heart attack, but are actually having a panic attack. So I'm sure you've heard of phobias before. There's a whole slew of phobias. I think the thing that I'm most afraid of are snakes, but I'm not really diagnosed with a phobia of snakes because it doesn't impair my functioning. Like my day-to-day functioning, I'm not around snakes, I'll be okay. Now, if I'm hiking, which I have up in the Smoky Mountains, and come across a really big rattlesnake, that did kind of scare me. But I made it through, and it's not affecting my daily life, so I don't have an actual phobia. A lot of people do have some phobias that are undiagnosed because it really doesn't impair their daily functions. But a phobia is just an intense fear of a particular situation or object. People do have social phobias, and this can get so hard that on them mentally and physically, that it's difficult for them to leave the house. And you may have heard of that specific phobia called agoraphobia, where you just kind of stay put in the house because you don't want to leave, because there's so many things that give you, anxiety when you get out. Being around people or other situations too can cause agoraphobia, but that's basically where you're shut in due to your anxiety. That is someone who definitely has a disorder, because it's not only deviant, but it's also distressful and gets in the way of their daily living. Post-traumatic stress disorder. So that has been on the rise. It affects people from war zones. You generally will see this with soldiers, but we also see this with victims of sexual assault, definitely. Those disorders usually have symptoms of trouble sleeping, social withdrawal, you become jumpy. This also happens if someone has a bad accident. My in-laws had a really awful accident in which one of them was life-flighted, helicoptered to a big research hospital in Nashville, and they still have some trauma left over from that several years later. So it's when you have lingering memories, nightmares for at least several weeks after an uncontrollably threatening event. So like a car accident where you have no control over it. In war, a lot of times you don't have control over the things that happen. But something that's important to note here is that while some people respond to these traumatic events with a disorder, some people can actually, and this happens frequently actually, is that traumatic events can also cause growth. And sometimes it becomes a stressful disorder at first and then causes growth. So much so that they've kind of named it post-traumatic growth. This allows people to become more empathetic to others because they can understand when people go through similar situations. Okay. I want to talk about these anxiety disorders as well as obsessive-compulsive disorder through the different perspectives, but we'll do that towards the end with an FRQ. So one more anxiety disorder, that's obsessive-compulsive disorder. So the obsessions are repetitive thoughts, and the compulsions are repetitive actions. So I'm sure you've all had sometimes you've had obsessive thoughts, right? So you think about something over and over and over again. A compulsion would be, checking to make sure that the stove is off or that the door is locked. Sometimes you have checking disorders that are like you hit a certain button on the elevator so many times. Okay, this allows people, when they do the checking or these compulsive compulsions, it decreases their anxieties, and that's why they do it. Okay. All right. So the dude on As Good as It Gets, you might think he is, or he does have OCD. So you can see how he decides to pack for his trip with Helen Hunt. Okay. So we need to talk about mood disorders. So you have anxiety disorders with this learning target and also various mood disorders like depression. Okay. So depression is not simply just feeling sad. Okay. That is not what depression is. It is prolonged hopelessness and lethargy. Okay. While we may say that anxiety is a fear of future loss, what depression really is, it's dealing with a past or a current loss. It could be a loss of a friend or a spouse or a romantic partner or a job, but generally it can be catalyzed or sparked or started by some sort of loss. Depression is growing. 13% of American adults will have depression some point in their lives. 44% of college students report at least some depression symptoms within the past school year. Okay, but to be clinically diagnosed with major depressive disorder, you have to have 5 signs of depression. And those signs of depression can be negative thoughts. It can be difficulty sleeping or sleeping too much. Both extremities are not good. Hopelessness, again, difficulty getting motivated, not feeling joy in the things that you used to feel joy with. Okay. But usually a negative life event, like that loss of a spouse or a breakup or a loss of a job, usually that negative life event precedes the depression. Okay. So I have a picture here of David Foster Wallace, mostly because he's one of my favorite writers. And the link there, he is a speech that he gave called This is Water, and it was a graduation speech. And what is so interesting about it is basically how to deal with negativity in your life, okay? And about how a college education is really about the ability to change not how you think, but just what you think about. And it gives you that understanding that you have the ability to choose. Why he talked about that is because depression was an issue for him. And this man, who obviously was very wise because he gave this speech which imparted lots of wisdom, and he was very creative and a great writer, he dealt with depression all his life, and he ended up committing suicide and ending his life because of his depression. I want to talk a bit about suicide because it relates to depression. Now, generally, people who commit suicide are not in like a depressive situation at that point. Usually they're kind of coming out of it, generally because in a deep depression, it's difficult to find the motivation to commit the act. Some things I wanted to talk about with suicide are just that it happens, generally women attempt suicide more, but men commit suicide more frequently because of the methods that they use. And generally it affects white men more, or white men and women more than it does Black men and women, or Latino or Latinas. So it's kind of interesting there. David Foster Wallace is kind of representative of the statistics about who would commit suicide. Okay. And generally it happens now with males who are older too. We're seeing a spike in suicide rates among that demographic. I also gave another resource here, an NPR story, and it's really interesting because it talks about how the method of suicide matters, and how having jump rails on bridges and not having access to firearms is just super important, mostly because suicide is generally, but not always, a pretty impulsive act. That if you have time, you understand or some of the depressive symptoms kind of alleviate. And so the person, if they have time between the thought and the action, that they don't actually do it if they don't have a method handy. So bipolar disorder, that is when you kind of move from the two extremes of depression and mania. Mania is basically you're kind of hyperactive. A lot of writers have or had bipolar disorder. Virginia Woolf there, Walt Whitman, Ernest Hemingway. Some of our great authors have had bipolar disorder, mostly because in that manic state, sometimes you can produce quite a bit. Yeah. It affects bipolar disorder affects both women and men equally. It tends to be more dysfunctional actually than just depression, and it affects your work life more, even though sometimes those manic episodes you can produce quite a bit during those. Okay, dissociative disorders. So there's several dissociative disorders. Here I have a picture of a man who was pretending to have a dissociative disorder. Walter White in Breaking Bad, hands down, one of the best TV shows out there. Tell me if you agree in the chat box. Any Breaking Bad fans? I put it up like The Wire and Breaking Bad. And my husband's like, yeah, you got to put The Sopranos in there too. I don't know. Anyway, it's one of my favorites, but in one of the episodes, he pretended to have to be in a fugue state where he did not remember anything. Okay, so a dissociative disorder is when you are disassociating from reality. Sometimes you don't have memory of events that occurred during your dissociative event. Sometimes this has a good evolutionary value or like a protective value to people, because sometimes they just can't deal with overwhelming memories or actions that are happening, and so therefore they disassociate themselves. I don't have the other slide up, but the other, there's like just general dissociative disorders where you are losing memory or consciousness, and there's DID, dissociative identity disorder. And it's not listed there on the learning target, but it's certainly one that can come up on your AP exam. We used to call this multiple personalities. So for dissociative identity disorder, you have to have 2 or more identities that control your behavior. So this is kind of interesting. People with dissociative identity disorder can have different voices and different mannerisms for their different identities. Something that's really interesting is some people have cases where they have different handedness, and there's also differences in vision, like between the 2 personalities. And what's also interesting is they could hook people up like to brain scans and see with their different identities, see different kind of like brain patterns. That's interesting as well. So there does seem to be like something to it, definitely. Okay, so somatoform disorder, soma means body. So this is where you don't recognize, I guess, the psychological component, and it kind of manifests itself in the body. So people who have frequent headaches, stomach aches, difficulty swallowing, these kind of come about or come under the umbrella of somatoform disorders, particularly if they have no other cause. They can't find any biological or physiological reason for the problem, okay? Sometimes this can get so bad that people actually like lose vision or lose loss of, they lose feeling in body parts, like they've like stuck a pin through someone's hand and the person just could not feel it because of this somatoform disorder, where they basically just have no ability to feel particular body parts with no, again, it has to have no physiological or biological reason for that. So they kind of assume that it must have a psychological reason. Okay, so here we have talked about anxiety disorders, mood disorders, including depression and bipolar disorder, dissociative disorders, and somatoform disorders. So I want to review the different perspectives with you guys in relation to these different disorders. So this comes from the 2001 AP Psychology exam, where you had to discuss the cause of anxiety from each of the following perspectives. Don't you hate that about the AP Psych exam? It's not like that you don't get a choice. You've got to do all of them, okay? So there are a couple of you in the chat box. If you will kind of take any one of these and kind of give us something that goes along with any of these perspectives. Or I put one more up here that I wanted to talk about. Social, cognitive, and behavioral can be together. Okay, so that's why it does not have listed social cognitive over here, because social cognitive is kind of like a subgroup, can be a subgroup of behavioral. Okay, so if you guys will want to chime in and give us something that you know about any of these perspectives. I'd like to first talk about is just what are these perspectives about, and then kind of relate them to anxiety, depression, other mood disorders. So the biological approach is basically that nature component of nature versus nurture. It says that our inherited traits are what cause us to do certain things. Okay, and so we need to talk about that in relation to anxiety. Is anxiety biological? Well, it pretty much has a pretty high correlation. Some people say, some psychologists put it at around 35 to 40%. And how they do this, how they always tease out between nature versus nurture, are through twin studies. So they've actually looked at some twin studies and saw that twins raised apart had the exact same phobia, okay, of water. They looked at two different twins raised apart, and they not only both had anxiety, but they both had anxiety about the same particular thing, which I thought was pretty odd. And they both reported that they could not go into the ocean more than like ankle deep, and they always had to walk backwards. And these were two twins that were raised apart. That's pretty weird, huh? So there's definitely some evidence that anxiety can be biological, as well as depression. There's some evidence that shows that depression is inherited, and that there are certain genes. We'll talk about how serotonin and norepinephrine play a role in both anxiety and depression when we talk about treatment, because it certainly does. And so you can see that there's definitely a biological component to both anxiety and depression. The evolutionary perspective is basically, that's the one that's not the same too, right? So evolutionary perspective is that we have inherited these traits for a reason, to help us either survive or to help the species survive through reproduction. So what's interesting is there's a lot of people with fears of snakes. In fact, you can there was a research study where they gave kids coloring sheets, and they were able to pick out snakes before they could pick out many other different items that were hidden. We can spot that. We can see it because there was some probably evolutionary reason to protect us from, little things that slither on the ground that could bite us and kill us. So some phobias, like fear of heights, definitely have an evolutionary reason. So we don't die, so we don't jump off cliffs and die. So there is some validity to that approach definitely with phobias. Social cognitive. So social cognitive perspective basically says that we learn from others, and this also affects our thoughts. And so especially with depression, you can definitely see how thoughts can influence your feelings. Okay. And the social cognitive perspective is also going to show how different cultures, because they have different social structures, would have different rates of anxiety and depression. And that's definitely true. So more individualistic cultures, because they have more emphasis on the self are going to have higher rates of depression and anxiety, and they do, than more collectivist cultures. So some of those thoughts that can affect your mood are, do you think that your problem is stable or temporary? You think that the problem is temporary, you think that it's going to go away, and so that leads to healthier outcomes. Do you think that the problem that is existing is global or specific? Is it just this one thing that you're having a problem with? Or do you think like, because I'm failing this test, then I must be a bad person, and I'm also bad at X, Y, and Z too? So that obviously is more negative thinking that then impacts depression. Also, do you have an internal regard, or do you think about things externally? And here it actually helps with depression if you think about your problem as external to you instead of completely internalizing it. So let's say you're going through a divorce and you think that it's completely your fault. Then you're internalizing all of, you are placing the burden all on yourself instead of, it takes two to tango, and both of the partners had a role in the demise of the relationship. So those different types of thinking can influence your level of depression. And so that's what the social cognitive perspective lends to these anxiety and mood disorders. Okay, psychodynamic. So this is Freud. So here we're going to focus on the reason for the disorder is something about the past that you are repressing, or some relationship with a parental figure. Okay, and so basically you're repressing, and how the psychologist or psychiatrist is going to bring you out of that is to kind of get at those repressed memories and bring them to the surface. Okay, so anxiety then is caused by repression of past events or feelings. The behavioral perspective here is kind of similar to that social cognitive in that it's learned, especially that social aspect, that you can learn things either from others or from past events. If you were reinforced, then you do the behavior more. So let's say if you check on the stove and that alleviates your anxiety, then you're going to continue to check on the stove because it alleviates that anxiety, because you were reinforced by the lack of anxiety after the checking. Okay, so the behavioral perspective also can kind of explain psychological disorders. You've behaved a particular way in the past, and that has been either helpful or harmful, and it's changed your behavior for the future. Okay, all right. So again, we've talked about just the intro to clinical psychology and diagnosis. We've talked about anxiety disorders, which there are several. We've talked about mood disorders of major depression, bipolar. We talked about somatoform disorders, which are basically disorders that are affecting the body, but there's no physiological reason for it, so it has to be psychiatric. And we've talked about dissociative disorders, where you kind of depart from reality, or you cannot recall events. And some people depart often with multiple identities with that disorder. So we've talked about these disorders. Next week, we're going to talk about schizophrenia and some other disorders. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about how we treat all these things. And that's our clinical psychology unit. Thanks for joining us today, and hopefully I'll see you next week. Let me know if you have any questions in the chat box, okay? Thanks.